welcome.
Happy to be here.
This is our new in-person studio format. So thank you for being here and having this conversation with us. So we just got back from the AWS Summit in Toronto, and that was a blast. What do you think about that one?
Absolutely. I mean, I think these AWS summits that we've been to, we just did London, then Toronto. We are now on our big tour. We're going to do New York.
It is
next
summit
month.
time. Lots of amazing things happening. And
Correct.
It's great to hear that my colleagues are doing such a good job of getting these
and the
put
reception
together.
has been phenomenal. Like, I think the crowd that's been coming in, they're curious, they're engaged. And this time, like I was saying a short while ago, I was really surprised to see a lot of students coming in to the summit to learn more about the cloud and the opportunities over there. And it was really fascinating. Kids coming up and talking about the projects that they're working on, which are very AWS centric, and thinking about what they could do with it and career prospects going forward. It was a really fascinating conversation.
I always enjoy meeting that youngest generation of aspiring technologists. And the funny thing is, you can say, well, the cloud replaces your data center. And then they give you this funny look of, what's a data center, you old guy? I don't even know what that's all about. Then you explain the concept of data centers, like, ooh, that's so weird. Why would you do that? And
I think there's this big dichotomy where at these summits, you will meet people, where the expectation of a data center just seems very absurd. And at the other end of the spectrum, you still have people who are like, oh, this cloud thing, what is it? And they're here to try to figure out
it's
how
absolutely always new for somebody. And I try really hard to remind myself of that all the time, that I just don't want to assume that just because I've been evangelizing AWS for 20 years at this point, that everybody knows about it. And I don't take it as some kind of personal failing that the whole world hasn't heard about it so far. And it's always new to somebody, and everybody's in a different phase in their career and their life. And so it's great to know that we haven't reached the entire world just yet. So we've all got plenty of opportunities for the future to continue talking about this.
Awesome. So I thought what we do in today's episode is we'd like to play a game of Mythbusters, it's one of my favorite shows, that I've loved watching for years. We'd love to bring up some myths around 3 different categories. One is evangelism. I want to talk about AWS's views about cost optimization. And I also want to talk about AWS's role in the future of tech. So let's try and cover as much as possible. I know you're short on time, so let's dive right in. Cloud is more expensive than an on-premise setup.
So I used to hear that, and we've done a lot of studies over the years talking to actual customers. And when you go all in and you really measure all of the costs, from real estate to power and cooling to physical security to that intangible but very real cost, if that's not a paradox, of your flexibility that you get, of saying, if I own a lot of things, my mental thinking is, well, I have these instances and these servers, and I need to actually wedge my problem to fit onto those servers. And when you invert that and say, here's my problem, I need to actually choose the appropriate environment to run it in, that's a very real thing that happens all the time. I don't think we're seeing a new emphasis on costs. I think what we're seeing is that people have always cared about the costs, but when it's one lump thing on the bottom line, they're saying that's not sufficient detail. So for years, we've given them a lot of different tools. We've shown them, here's analysis, here's reports. I think we're very open and direct with the prices and for everything. The one part I'm still hoping that people will do more is really think, for every business function that they actually run on their cloud, what is the most fine-grained level of measurement they could do to say, what does it cost us every time a user does a search on the website? Which the level of cost detail that we have, you should be able to know, okay, it costs 1 microcent to do a search, okay? We do the search. What is the value we get from all the search results? In theory, that should be what you care about for costs. Like, what if it costs you $1 to do a search, let's say, but you only got 50 cents in return from your search results? Well, you need to either return better results or make your searches cheaper, or say it's not economical for us to even offer a search feature. So I'd like to see people think about it really at that level, saying, instead of just saying, well, we've got a rack of servers and the whole thing in aggregate is the best we can do for cost, how could you, with incredible fine-grained resolution, understand the cost of every different business function you do.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the FinOps practice of trying to identify unit costs for whatever service that you're offering. I have seen very, very few organizations that have that level of granularity of information to be able to even compute that, because everything is invariably so tied in. A lot of the organizations are coming in from big monolithic, application cultures where the on-prem everything was like one big server running multiple different services. You migrate them over to the cloud. And I think where the shock comes in is when they move to AWS, their mental framework is still of using AWS like a data center, where they're still stuck on just EC2s. And the more mature in that mind frame is to say, oh, we're going to run everything on Kubernetes. But that's kind of where the services stop, or where their use of AWS stops. And they think they're in the cloud when they use that. When you start using the higher order services, you suddenly realize that your cost could be down as much as 90%.
Exactly.
If you actually started using the higher order services. But I don't think people realize that that's what you need to leverage in the cloud. Not the EC2 and the Kubernetes stuff seems like the bare bone, bare essential, least common denominator in the cloud.
Well, and not just that, but when you're comparing it to the on-prem, your best case is that you don't break anything and that it just keeps working. But you're never going to get, all of a sudden everything got 6 times faster just because I kept doing this.
Right.
Where you see with all the blog posts where we see announcements of a new feature gets added for free in all regions. It's already been tested. You get a 10x on this or a 5x on that. That will never happen if you're just maintaining the status quo, right? And all of your efforts going to be eaten up with security and patching and
exactly
dealing with the hardware.
I've talked to customers in the past. I remember the early days. I was at an HPC conference, and the HPC folks were pretty skeptical at first of the value of the cloud. And somebody was looking at our instance price per hour and saying, "Oh, my data center is this other price." And then someone from another university said, "Oh, so who actually runs all this, and where does your electricity come from?" "Oh, the university gives us free electricity, and grad students do it all for free." It's like, well, if you really want to understand your costs, you need to understand all those different elements of it.
True.
Well, and then once you understand the unit economics, then you can start aligning incentives, right? So that way, the people who are responsible for really expensive features can then get charged back for them, and then figure out how to optimize them.
Exactly.
Yeah. One of the examples that I share with a lot of folks is, if I were to run an API service, even if I went and deployed it on a T4 micro or even a T4 small, it's going to cost me at least $400 to $500 a month to kind of keep it all, or $400 to $500 a year. I think it was the math, to keep it just running and do the very basics. Instead, if I hosted it in Lambdas, right, and let's say I wanted to serve 10 million requests, that would cost me $10. Like, there's an order of magnitude difference when you start using these higher services.
I routinely hear about kind of very specific purpose enterprise apps that maybe they get used like weekly or monthly by a small population, and they've been moved over to run on Lambda and serverless. Yeah. And they are $5 and $10 a month kind of apps, where the cost to build those apps is never going to be smaller than the cost to run them. Right? They're serving some special purpose, but maybe they're serving that special purpose just on some periodic basis. But then maybe it's the end of month thing, and everybody wants to pile on and do the end of month thing for a couple hours. Perfect way to use serverless.
Exactly. So I think when it comes to, just a quick stat, across the 150 plus companies that we bought, we found that the average resource utilization on anything that existed in the data centers was far less than 2%. Okay, and 2% is like a good number to see. So wherever you can leverage infrastructure that uses the elastic nature of that infrastructure, that's where you will benefit, in especially the enterprise use cases, like where for the most part it's hard. Those machines are just lying around not doing anything.
They are, and part of that was just, you've got your budget, you might as well order the brightest, shiniest stuff. But also that's also you're buying for peak capacity, because you don't have the elasticities. You say, well, every alternate Thursday afternoon, I'm going to get all this traffic. I need a server that can deal with that, and it doesn't talk about the other days and other times where you don't.
Yeah. So what do we call this one? The myth that the cloud is more expensive than on-premise?
I think it's busted. I think it's busted.
Busted. All right, we'll have some great graphics. Busted. There we go. All right. So picking one provider causes vendor lock-in. And we hear this a lot. People come up to our booth and say, well, do you do multi-cloud? And say, no, our bet's on AWS. And say, well, we're really concerned that one of the hyperscalers might vanish one day. And so we're kind of hedging our bets. So how do you address that one?
I mean, I have like personal dependencies on earth and gravity and air and stuff like that as well.
So you have to have a second oxygen supply.
Exactly. In the early days, I think I heard a lot about we've got this cloud and this cloud, and we've also got this open source thing that we can run in our data center as a hedge. And some of those are reasonable. And in a time of uncertainty, you say, well, I'm going to effectively, it's almost like proceeding in like this parallel universe thing. And like, I don't know which one's going to succeed, so I'll just make them all go forward. I think the reality is if you're going to really build apps that take advantage of the cloud, you're not going to want to either split your dev team into two halves and train one on cloud A and the rest on cloud B, or try to somehow get everybody to have skills in both. Or there used to be these weird libraries. You say, well, run it on top of this, and it will somehow give you the benefit of all the clouds. But It's usually some kind of lowest set of common functionality that works across all the clouds.
Yep.
Every cloud has unique features, and unless you're really taking advantage of those unique features and taking advantage of them right away when they're launched, you're going to lose out to the competition who is.
Correct.
So you need to be in this position to say, brand new feature came out on AWS this morning. My dev team's on it. We're building right now. We're launching tomorrow afternoon.
Right.
That's how you keep your customers happy. That's how you stay in the lead.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. We see the same thing with cloud cost optimization tools. When we've tried out a lot of these tools that kind of try to span all the different cloud providers, what you get is the least common denominator functionality with no depth, with no deep expertise. And
so right sizing based on CPU and memory.
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's again one of those very generic solutions without the depth that you would expect, which is why when it comes to CloudFix, for example, that's where AWS is where our expertise is, and that's where we will continue to focus.
If someone was truly concerned, I think you could build an application where all of your business logic is effectively in some kind of modules or components that really did not depend on any particular cloud functions. The true core business logic,
right.
and then have another part, and that's your portable part.
And that part's usually really, really small too. Like that's almost nothing, right? Like think about, I don't know, a Sudoku game, right? With Sudoku, you write it in an interview, but then the user registration and the logging and the forgot my password, please email me a temporary, like all that extra stuff, right? That's the cloud specific stuff.
When I talk to customers about what their long-term challenges are, it isn't often, well, we have a bunch of apps, so we need to keep moving them from place to place to place over years and decades. It's more about data continuity and this idea that there's databases of some sort, and the challenge is we need to maintain the integrity of that data over the long term. And a migration is mostly get a lot of data moved to a new place, and then maybe even take that opportunity to modernize and rebuild the applications. The applications themselves are not quite throwaway, but they don't have the same expectation of perpetuity as the data does.
Correct. I agree. Also, like you said earlier, there are certain dependencies we have. I don't think most folks even realize that they already have lock-ins at so many different levels, whether it be your processor. Like everyone's written code over the last 20, 30 years on x86 for the most part, right? You've already got lock-in on the architecture, but I don't think we ever questioned that, we're writing for x86. What if, RISC or ARM or, these instruction sets or these architectures, became the next new standard.
Very true. Although it does turn out that porting from x86 to ARM is actually
exactly
straightforward.
Yeah. So once we had the virtual machine layers for languages like Java and so on, that became easier. But even languages, like we've written our applications with a particular language in mind. So there's a certain lock-in.
And sentiment or community can change around those languages. And
exactly.
Unless you really understand the long-term future of your language, it's entirely possible that the language and the runtime might not end up being maintained and move forward. And like whenever I'm looking at some piece of open source code, I look at the functionality of what it offers me, but I also look at the community. And so how many people are actually involved in making sure that this thing is going to continue to be maintained? Was the last commit sometime a half a decade ago.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'll see a link to something online. It's like, wow, this is really cool. This is going to solve a great problem for me.
Right.
You click through to the repo, and the last commit was from like
Correct.
2018. It's like, okay, this is effectively dead, and I don't want to end up being the maintainer for this by accident.
Correct. So I think at the end of the day, it's just a risk reward calculation to say, yeah, there is a risk that, your vendor or the architecture or whatever decisions you made are going to be defunct. But if you really use probability to kind of figure out what that risk is versus the reward of, moving quickly, innovating really fast and getting something out there to customers, that risk reward seems straightforward.
And that's where you want to look at people and you want to see, okay, it makes sense to be risk averse, but it should be risk averse at the exact same level across all the different risks you're trying to mitigate, right? So it can't be that one of them is 10 orders of magnitude different than the other, right? So if you're worried about your hyperscaler, you should also worry about, power and natural disasters and all kinds of other long tail events.
Indeed. And also, do you want to run it reduced efficiency effectively through your entire dev cycle on a cloud? Maybe you say, well, I want to hedge my bets. I want to be on A and B. And for that entire time, until something happens to one of them, you're running at this reduced efficiency when you could have been putting that energy into making your product better for your customers.
Couldn't agree more. So what are we calling this one? The myth that picking one provider causes vendor lock-in, or picking AWS causes vendor lock-in?
I've never heard someone come back to me and say, we feel locked in. When I think about the hundreds of customer conversations I have a year, someone come to me and say, we now feel trapped. We can't do anything. I've never heard that sentiment.
I couldn't agree more.
So picking one provider causes vendor lock-in, myth busted. Busted.
Absolutely. Right. I have known AWS and worked with AWS since 2007 very closely, and I have known Amazon as an organization and AWS in particular to be very, very customer obsessed. And I've loved that about AWS. Increasingly, as we put out, CloudFix in the market, a lot of customers come and ask us, doesn't AWS not like what you're doing? Doesn't AWS, have an objection to, whatever tools that are, going to save customers money because, again, their spend goes down? How does AWS respond to it? I know the answer from speaking to pretty much everyone at AWS, but
the way I like to think about this is that we really appreciate what you're doing to make our customers more efficient. And a lot of times they will jump into the cloud with both feet, and they'll do the straightforward, obvious things to get going. And then as that usage scales, maybe those obvious things, there's a better way. We certainly give customers a lot of guidance and a lot of information to say, this is how you can keep continuing to optimize your costs. But what you do is absolutely essential. And a lot of times when customers say we want to reduce our costs, it isn't that they want to, that they're actually saying, let's free up some budget so we can do more things in the cloud. So the actual net spend might end up being equal or level over time, but the amount of functionality that they're getting is going to continue to grow.
Right. And just from all of my conversations that I've had with AWS over the years, I think the mutual working model has always been that AWS wants every customer to be as efficient as possible. And if you can free up budget from something that's inefficient, use it to explore something new. Use it to explore one of the higher order services. Do something new with it. And the more you do that, you actually fall in love with those services for its efficiency.
Exactly. And some of the new things that people are getting into, when you think about training large models, like building large language models, everybody's talking about them, and it's like, okay, we had the raw data, we did a training session. What is not really well known is that a lot of those training runs are 7-figure runs, and that a lot of common models have been through dozens to hundreds of training iterations. So when you talk about, let's just build a model and do something fun with it, that's a really interesting new cost. So now we're at a different model of not just are your resources going to be used as efficiently as possible.
Right.
We're now at this more abstract level of how do you do training really efficiently, and is that using the right data, the right algorithms,
correct,
making sure that you can measure accurately whether you've done a great job of it. This is an entirely new field that people are just barely becoming aware of. The actual the cost and the iteration time of building these great models.
Right. Actually, on the flip side of it, which is for folks who don't necessarily want to generate these new models, but want to start leveraging a bunch of these new generative AI models, even just hosting and using inference over these models are not cheap exercises, right? I mean, you want throughput, you want the ability to scale. So even when you want to host some of these, I mean, the minimum cost of running the most basic model with minimum throughput is probably going to be $10 to $15 an hour. And a lot of organizations that I speak to, they're trying to figure out where to free up budget to be able to experiment and go create these new solutions where they leverage a bunch of these models. So now Falcon, the $40 billion model is now available on AWS. There are a bunch of new models that, I mean, every day on Hugging Face, you see these new models coming up that are doing some incredible work. Just to be able to leverage them and start experimenting and trying to figure out something needs budgets.
Exactly. And this is, I think, coming back to what I said earlier about the fact that you need to understand at the most fine-grained level possible what it costs to do an operation. It's wonderful, for example, let's say you are, I've seen some websites that are now summarizing search results using some kind of a model.
Right.
Super wonderful. What is the cost to do that on a per search basis?
Exactly.
And is it a really awesome, cool thing you're doing as a loss leader, or is it actually driving your business? And I think with even though we've got things like the Trainium to help you build your models efficiently and Inferentia to help you do your inferencing efficiently, you still need to actually understand what does it cost to get these results, and is it worthwhile, or is it just the cool kind of, all the cool kids are doing it, so I need to do it as well.
At some point, that business model is it's really hard to monetize if that's what you're doing. Is that what you're saying? This summarizing search results is
whatever thing you're doing, you have to make sure that there's an actual positive business value to it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that doesn't change if it is simple search results out of a database or something really, really, really awesome out of a gigantic trillion parameter model.
Couldn't agree more. So on this one, so just repeating the myth, which is AWS would be worried about sales when it comes to cost optimization tools out there.
I could bust that in so many different ways, right? Let's call it busted, but look at all the times we've reduced prices over the years. Sure. And we drive down prices on storage, on bandwidth, on instances. We give you more efficient versions of everything at the same price. We're working behind the scenes to make even ancient services. Like we take the simple queue service, which you'd think that all the developers are now retired and sitting on the beach. There's people watching that every day and looking at the metrics and the utilization and saying, when we built that back in 2004, 2005, we built it the best we knew how. Right. Now that it's running at this vast scale, this vast world scale, there's always something new you can learn about it that is not all, partially scale, but partially statistical. That says, well, we've been doing this for so long, we actually have incredibly deep historical data that can give us great guidance on performance and failovers and how many replicas do you need, all kinds of really interesting stuff that you only get at scale. You don't get any of this when you're doing it in your own data center. Completely agree.
I'll just add one other piece of a personal anecdote. Every time I've spoken to the product teams at AWS, and ever since we put out CloudFix, I am amazed as to how engaged and the collaborative the work is on trying to figure out what is it that customers are doing wrong, or how is it that they're operating inefficiently. And every one of the product teams comes back and says, I really wish customers didn't do this way and did it this way, because that would make them so much more efficient. That would make them, not spend this kind of money. And we are happy to be, collaborative partners with AWS and trying to take all of those insights and put them into a simple tool that customers can use. So I have never known AWS to say, "Oh, I'm worried about customers saving money." Like it's so much in the DNA of AWS.
I've never heard that sentiment expressed, and it goes back to customer obsession, which is our first leadership principle. And ultimately, we want our customers to succeed. And if the customers succeed, they're going to find ways to consume more and more services.
Yep, absolutely.
I think that's a myth busted then. Awesome.
Oh, busted.
Here's to AWS's role in future tech.
Yeah. So the first myth over here is that AWS never builds anything that has not been requested by a customer.
So anything would be 100%. The guidance that we get from management, from Adam and previously from Andy, is that about 90% of what we build should be traceable back to an actual customer conversation. Okay. And not just some anecdotal, I heard that this company over here thinks we should do this. Like a very detailed multi-paragraph summary of, I sat down with the lead developers at this company and this is what they told me. So that's what we mean by traceable back to individual customers. The last 10% should be owned usually by the product team and usually by the product manager. They're the ones that should have a bit of a kind of a vision and a roadmap of this is where we'd like to go for the longer term. That's also, of course, going to be more informed by customer conversations as well. But the idea is that sometimes because they're in this very privileged situation and they can hear from so many different customers and they can have maybe a better awareness of the world around them than the customers have time to do.
Got it.
Then they should have that vision to say, okay, this is where we think we should be taking it. Generally, we'll take that step or we'll propose it to customers and they'll say, okay, that's awesome. We didn't even think about that, but it's totally obvious now. Other times it's like, what are you guys smoking? That's not even close to a thing we would possibly need. So even if it's something that we dreamed up internally, we're going to have very detailed private conversations with a lot of customers. When I get a document for a new instance type, let's say, there are, in one of the appendices, there are detailed recaps with 50 to 100 customers sometimes. It's okay, they like this series of instances. They would prefer if the next ones had more of this or a different ratio of memory to CPU or more bandwidth per vCPU, or they want faster clock cycles or whatever they want.
Got it.
And so all those different things are aggregated together as we try to figure out how do we keep meeting needs of customers over time. So it's very detailed, very specific.
Got it.
And there's a lot of planning, and there's a lot of interested parties. And I've found, whether it's personally or in a tech situation, whenever there's this like big reveal moment, it's like, oh wait, we've done something wrong. You don't want a big reveal, right? You want a lot of people along for the journey to get there.
Exactly. A lot of things that we launch, it's totally obvious in retrospect that there was something of either the industry was heading in the right direction, and it's kind of like this kind of like a stepping stone showing up under your foot just as you step down, or it's a very obvious need that you had that hopefully we figured out that we are now saying, okay, this is exactly the thing I was looking for.
Got it.
So is there going to be a set of AWS VR goggles? Probably won't happen.
Not that I've heard about.
Awesome.
On the other hand, we've got GPU instances that are great for rendering all that great.
Okay, so you could power content that would be displayed in someone else's VR goggles.
We can do that. We've got local zones in lots of locations that can be used to give you low latency to your headsets.
Okay, cool.
Awesome. So we'll call this one confirmed that, largely the features and services that get put out are driven.
One thing that's awesome is we do not have a traditional R&D organization. So my stereotype of R&D in a lot of companies, you take your smartest people that are also the most socially awkward and you say, okay, all you really amazing folks, hide over there. Never, ever, ever talk to customers because it's going to cause problems, and invent crazy stuff and then hand it off to us and we'll figure out how to sell it. That is almost like the movie caricature of how R&D works, right? All your eccentric eggheads are in the lab, and then they hand you this 5-sided wheel. And you're like, oh, I'm in marketing, but I have no idea how to sell 5-sided wheels. This is going to be a challenge.
And maybe it works for like DARPA or something like that, where they can have these very strange projects and see how they play out. But that's a very like you said, it's like the movie case, right? It doesn't necessarily work in a business setting. It's the rare
visionary who actually understands customers well enough to build actual things for customers. You just invent. It's that old open source of scratch your own itch. You invent the thing that is the thing you really need. And maybe you remember in the late 90s in Silicon Valley, all these folks that had suddenly become successful and prosperous were like inventing like incredibly expensive stereo systems. Like there were $20,000 stereo systems, and that was all the rage in Silicon Valley. It's like, I'm so happy you can afford one, but the rest of us can't afford and can't appreciate what you've done there. And
I remember they would tweak it to, like the audio heads would care about some, frequency range where the fidelity was incredibly high. Like completely not decipherable.
So it's far better just to listen to a lot of loud music and just ruin that part of your hearing spectrum. It's far cheaper in the long term.
Well, the audiophiles I've spoken to said once they have it, then they can't enjoy music out of a regular, at a pool party coming from a little Alexa, right? They just can't enjoy it anymore.
But some of the testing has also proven that that's a little bit subjective. That if you told them it was an expensive tube amplifier hand wired by gnomes, then they're like, oh wow, that sounds amazing, and and then like building for your own needs. Like in the early days of mobile, before mobile coverage was inexpensive and ubiquitous, like it pretty much is now.
Right.
You'd see all these Silicon Valley apps that would come out, and it's like, okay, that's an amazing app. Nobody else besides you in San Francisco and San Jose has that level of connectivity.
Correct.
1% of the population owns those phones.
True.
You have to think about that. And yet, yes, trends are important, but you also want to have something that's out there and usable in the short term.
Makes total sense. So we'll call this one confirmed. So let's go on to the next one, which again is a question that everyone's been asking about, which is the role of AWS in developing bleeding edge AI solutions. And there's a general conversation out there that Amazon is kind of lagging behind, or AWS lagging behind the other front runners. How do you respond to that, or what perspective would you offer?
So the way I see it is we've actually been doing a lot for a very, very long time. We can go back to things like the original Deep Racer.
Right.
We taught people how to do reinforcement learning, and that's been around, 5 years plus at this point.
Right.
Back before everybody was talking about generative AI, we had a product called the Deep Composer that it wasn't a gigantic success. It was this little musical keyboard.
I have the keyboard.
Yes, you and 3 others
from back in the day.
Okay, we were showing the world the way very, very early. We've had SageMaker and SageMaker notebooks for a very, very long time. We've got amazing tutorials. We've got a lot of great things that show people how to load up these great models in SageMaker. I saw one just yesterday showing how to do stable diffusion on SageMaker, for example. And I'm leaving on vacation really soon, so I can't actually dive into that, but it looks really interesting. And so because we're building things for developers, we don't have something that you just go to a website and type things in and say, do this amazing thing for me.
Right.
But we've got the Tranium, we've got the Inferentia, we've got many, many different models that are available easily on AWS. We've got Bedrock under development to make it easy for customers to access a wide range of models, both from Amazon and from other organizations. A lot's in the works. A lot of the thinking also from what we hear from our customers, they love these large public models. Those are great. But the customers say that is an amazing initial step. What we really care about is we want to use that as a base, and we want to make sure that that model is aware of our own company.
Right.
Has it been trained on our own corpus of documents? Does it know about my database? Does it know about my business analytics? So I think a lot of what we're seeing is companies saying, give me something where I can go and say, that's powered by my wiki. That is, in addition to the basic model, it understands it understands what your wiki is all about, and say, oh, okay, this is how you file an expense report, or this is how you book travel.
Yeah, I think from personal experience, I'd say AWS has built some of the most incredible infrastructure to actually drive AI-based solutions that are foundational for scale, for doing things not just as an experiment, but also at scale. And that's been...
I think we've been building to this time for a very, very long time. And we've already announced the second generation of Tranium, and you can take those instances powered by Traniums, and you can make these ultra clusters with thousands and thousands and thousands of Traniums available to you. There's like gigabit level networking between them. I think we call them ultra clusters, where you can have maybe tens of thousands of instances connected together. So these are things that our customers are doing and will be able to do to build these world scale models.
That's awesome.
Well, and I guess thinking about, referencing the name of the most recent, Bedrock, we're still at the lower levels, right? It's going to, in 5 years, I'm guessing, or maybe 5-10 years, there's going to be an order of magnitude more options with Bedrock as the foundation, just like EC2 and S3 are kind of foundational of the original AWS stack.
Yeah, and we should also mention Bedrock, not Bedrock, Code Whisperer. Code Whisperer is really cool. It's been trained on a lot of internal Amazon code and open source code as well. And you can use that as a programming assistant. You say, I need a function to get something from S3 bucket. and draw. Like I did one where I said, okay, fetch things from a bucket and draw some text on the images. You can do 100 web searches, or you can just ask Code Whisperer to start putting those kinds of things together for you.
Very true.
Well, I found AI-driven coding has really made me always enjoy it again, because I really enjoy programming. I don't get to do it as much on a day-to-day basis, but then I always worry, okay, I don't want to get stuck in the weeds and burn half a day going down the wrong way. And to be able to type this in and say, okay, I know how to read this, I know how to understand this, I can modify this a little bit, but it's really could reignite
so
that
that's
spark.
A really interesting balance that we're going to have to make sure that programmers of the future are trained into. We're in this transition time where we had to do it ourselves before.
Right.
So we can look at something that AI has built for us and say, that's good, or that's not good, or that's maybe not quite there. If you only counted on AI to do everything for you, but you didn't have that understanding of the foundations, you kind of be like the coyote that runs across at the cliff, and suddenly there's nothing underneath you, and you're like,
right.
Uh-oh, now what do I do? And
yeah, I think you need the deep expertise to be able to leverage.
Or the roadrunner. It was the roadrunner that goes across the cliff, not the coyote. Right, you're suddenly out there like hanging out in the air. It's like, wait, I don't understand any of this code.
Yeah,
but it does the thing I need to do. We still need to make sure. Maybe this is the same argument that 2 generations ago it was, can we allow math students to use calculators or not?
Right.
Maybe it's the same argument all over again.
Or the advent of computers. I mean, that it was the argument over there where people were scared that computers would replace their jobs, but the people who were able to leverage the computers were the people who really understood the core content and then how to leverage another tool that made their job easier.
I think so. Like, to me, programming is different now than it was in the times when I was good at it, in the sense that you used to learn the language, and the language was pretty small and self-contained, right? There was there were procedures and statements and data types and operators, and then there was a couple of dozen functions that you would need to call. Today, the language itself, you certainly have to learn the language, but the library of things that you can call is in the tens of thousands.
True.
So there's no practical way that you can understand all the libraries and all the things it gives you. And maybe what we're really going to get out of all the AI assistants is just helping to point you in the right direction and say, these are the libraries to use and these are the functions you can call. Here's my first attempt at putting it together. I think it's pretty good, but please take it and refine it from there.
Evangelism versus sales, right? And out there, you've been talking about AWS in all these different community forums. At the end of the day, when evangelism starts becoming sales or starts becoming, very tied into sales, it kind of puts people off. So where do you draw the balance? Or, is the evangelism that you see yourself doing, is that closely tied to sales or not? Or how do you?
In my particular role, it's not at all connected to sales. And if I do happen to find someone who needs to speak to sales, I will happily connect them to one of my colleagues who can take the conversation forward from there. I always think of evangelism as incredibly long-term, where it's like you're planting acorns and hoping that you'll have trees in 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. Yeah. And that is a very difficult thing in an organization where you want to report your success monthly, and every year you want to say, this is what I did last year.
Right.
And every organization that employs evangelists has this same interesting challenge of, how do you measure your success? How do you know what you're doing? And you try to just say, well, we hire great people. We know the activities that work, and we're going to really say, let's do as many of the activities that work. And we're going to know that over the long term, this is going to produce great results. And what's awesome to me is that I will often run into people that were in an audience 5 to 15 years ago. They will come up and say, I heard you, I met you at some event, and what you told me was really interesting and valuable. I listened, I did my own work, and I've actually made some progress in my career and my life as a result.
Right.
And you hear these decade-plus long success stories. They're really awesome, and it's really inspiring. It's not something you can put on your report and say, this is what I did last week, because you know that you're affecting a trajectory over the very, very long term.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think as organizational leadership, evangelism plays a really important role, because a large part of getting folks to understand what you're doing is also the education aspect of it. There's so much education that needs to be done, because it's invariably a paradigm shift in the way someone thinks about things. And if you tie it down to sales and pitches and stuff like that, I have never known it to work.
It becomes very obvious that you're part of sales versus
Yeah.
part of marketing. And that, to me, evangelism is simply absorb really amazing information about something that you personally care about that lights your brain on fire, and then share it with others and light their brains on fire as well.
Agreed.
But that fire might have to smolder for a bit. And maybe you're telling them about something new that's going to empower them to do something great.
Yeah.
Maybe in their current situation, they can appreciate it, but they can't do anything about it. So you're thinking, well, your next job, your next big project, then you can actually take advantage of this. So you want to maybe create some great memories that they're going to think, oh, last 6 months ago, I heard about the fact that the cloud helps me to scale a lot.
Right.
Now I've got this new project and I need to scale. Awesome. I'm going to go and remember that person I heard about, talk about it.
Stephen, what's your experience? You've been now doing this for 2 years?
Yeah.
If I got the timeline right.
Coming up on it. Well, because people ask me, so where do you fit? Are you sales? Are you marketing? I say the same sentiment. I'm taking the long-term view of things, and also I'm empowered to push back and to go internally and say, hey, this is fitting or this isn't fitting, and being able to be trusted kind of on both sides. So that's how I see it. And I have to maintain that trust, maintain that credibility.
Yeah.
And that trust is really important in our jobs because we're putting our personal identities out there when we do this. We're not just an anonymous person from the company. It's our name, it's our identity, it's our long-term reputation that is really at stake with everything that we do. And to me, that means you have to be direct, honest, authentic. You have to absolutely for sure know what you're talking about. And when you get to that precipice at the end of your knowledge, you never make something up. You never fake. You say, hey, that's awesome. I don't know that. I will happily research it and get back to you. But you have to, your credibility is just at stake with every piece of content you create and every conversation you have.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've truly appreciated whenever I've spoken to you or, anytime Stephen and I have conversations is the deep hands-on technical, knowledge around what we're talking about makes a big difference in the conversations. Like you can make out the difference between a sales conversation and someone who comes with that deep technical know-how when they're talking about a subject. And I think that like anytime I've seen an evangelist that I've really loved listening to or learned from a ton, that's the one common denominator that I find where they know their subject really well. They are hands-on and they aren't, reading off a pitch or a script, which you see sales folks do more often than not.
You have to be hands-on. Otherwise, you're not going to truly know your offering. And the simplest example that comes along for me all the time when I'm writing about a new service is that I'll be in the console for some new service and there'll be a button that says create. You hit that create button, a page comes up, you fill in all the parameters, you say, go for it.
Right.
The documentation never says, is that a minute or 5 minutes or half an hour worth of workflow processing? My teams never will actually commit to some upper bound because they say, well, there's workflows and there's all kinds of dependencies and they'll never even say, well, the SLA is this. Because then, if they say 30 minutes and it's 31, like, oh, we're at the SLA. And so what I've learned to do is first, I want to experience personally the fact that there is some kind of workflow that is initiated when you hit that button.
Right.
But then and this is one of those little tricks I invented. Instead of ever saying, well, it's a minute or 5 minutes or an hour, you just equate it to some human activity.
Right.
You say, I hit the create button and I walked the dog. I hit the create button, I had lunch. Hit the create button and called it a day.
Right.
You're not specifying any number of minutes or hours. You're setting expectations that people can identify with. And you're also adding this little human element.